You're drowning in your own thoughts. Right now, as you listen to this, there's probably a part of your mind already 3 steps ahead, wondering how long this video is, what you should do after, whether you remember to lock the door this morning. That's not thinking. That's mental noise masquerading as productivity. And here's what nobody talks about. Every thought you think that isn't necessary is stealing a piece of your soul, literally hollowing you out from the inside. Before we dive deeper into this together, I want to ask something small of you. If this resonates, if you're tired of the mental chatter that follows you everywhere, hit that subscribe button and give this video a like. It helps more people find their way to silence in a world that's forgotten how to be still. Because what I'm about to share with you isn't just theory, it's a way back to yourself. We live in the first generation in human history where thinking has become a disease. Not thinking itself, but the kind of compulsive, repetitive, empty thinking that most of us mistake for being alive. You know the kind I'm talking about. The mental hamster wheel that starts spinning the moment you wake up and doesn't stop until you collapse into bed. What's your first thought when you wake up? Really think about it for a second. Is it gratitude for another day? Wonder at being alive? Or is it immediately, what do I have to do today? Did I reply to that email? Why did I say that thing yesterday? What if this? What if that? I used to think this was normal. We all did. But here's something that changed everything for me. Last year, I spent time with my grandmother in her final weeks. She was 94, sharp as ever, but her body was finally ready to let go. And I noticed something profound about how she moved through her days. She would sit by the window for hours, just watching. Not scrolling, not planning, not reviewing yesterday's conversations or rehearsing tomorrow's, just present with what was in front of her. When I asked her what she was thinking about during those long silences, she smiled and said something I'll never forget. "I'm not thinking, honey. I'm just being." At first, I thought maybe her mind was slipping, but then I realized she had found something most of us lost decades ago. The ability to exist without constantly explaining that existence to ourselves. Think about a tree for a moment. A tree doesn't overthink how to grow. It doesn't lie awake at night worrying about whether its roots are strong enough or if its leaves are the right shade of green. It simply grows, responds to sunlight, drinks from rain. Somewhere along the way, we convinced ourselves that constant mental activity equals intelligence, that a quiet mind is an empty mind, that if we're not thinking, we're not alive. But what if we've got it completely backwards? Here's something that might surprise you. Your brain wasn't designed for the kind of thinking we do all day long. Neuroscientists have discovered something called the default mode network. Basically, it's what your brain does when you think you're doing nothing. But here's the catch. When most people think they're relaxing, their default mode network is actually hyperactive, spinning stories about the past and future, creating problems that don't exist, solving problems that aren't real. Dr. Judson Brewer at Yale has spent years studying this phenomenon. He found that the happiest, most mentally healthy people have one thing in common. Their default mode network is quiet. Not dead, not absent, just quiet. It's like the difference between a still lake and a lake with a motorboat circling, endlessly churning up mud from the bottom. Most of us live with the motorboat. And Here's what's really happening when we overthink. We're not actually solving problems. We're creating them. Every unnecessary thought is like dropping a pebble into still water. One pebble? Fine. 1,000 pebbles? You can't even see the bottom anymore. I remember sitting in a coffee shop a few months ago, watching a woman at the next table. She had her laptop open, phone face down but clearly checking it every few minutes, notebook beside her with a long to-do list. But she wasn't actually working on any of it. She was just cycling through worry. You could see it in her face, the slight furrow between her brows, the way she'd pick up her pen, then put it down, start typing, then delete what she wrote. She was thinking herself into paralysis. We've all been that woman. Maybe we still are. The cruel irony is that overthinking feels productive. It feels like we're handling things, being responsible, staying on top of life. But what we're really doing is wearing grooves in our mind, the same thought patterns, deeper and deeper, until we can't think anything else. It's like walking the same path through a field every day. Eventually, you create a rut so deep you can't see over the edges anymore. You forget there were ever other ways to walk.
So what does all this overthinking actually do to us? It hollows us out, and I mean that quite literally. When your mind is constantly busy with mental chatter, there's no space left for anything else. No room for intuition, no space for creativity, no capacity for the kind of deep listening that life requires. Think of your consciousness like a house. Overthinking is like filling every room with noise. Radios blasting different stations, TVs on different channels, conversations happening simultaneously in every corner. Where in that house do you go to hear your own voice? I used to think being busy in my head meant I was engaged with life, but I slowly realized I wasn't engaging with life at all. I was engaging with my thoughts about life, my interpretations of life, my fears about life, but never life itself. There's a difference between experiencing a sunset and thinking about how beautiful the sunset is, between feeling grateful and thinking you should feel grateful, between being present with another person and wondering what they think of you while they're talking. One fills you up, the other empties you out. And here's something most people don't realize. Overthinking isn't just mental, it's physical. When your mind churns, your body follows. Shallow breathing, tight shoulders, clenched jaw, restless energy with nowhere to go. Your body is trying to tell you something. It's saying, this isn't how we're supposed to live. Animals don't overthink. Watch a cat in the sun, a bird building a nest, a dog sleeping. They're completely absorbed in the present moment, not because they're simple, but because they understand something we've forgotten. Life is here, not in your thoughts about life, not in your plans for life, not in your regrets about life. Here, now, in this breath, in this moment. But how do we get back there? Every wisdom tradition throughout history has pointed to the same discovery. Silence isn't the absence of something, it's the presence of everything. The Buddhist concept of emptiness doesn't mean nothing exists. It means the space where everything can exist. The Christian mystics called it the cloud of unknowing, that place beyond thoughts and concepts where truth lives. The Taoists named it Wu Wei, acting without forcing, being without grasping. Different words for the same recognition. that beneath all our mental noise is something vast and still and inexhaustibly alive. But we're afraid of silence, aren't we? We fill every gap with podcasts, music, notifications, conversations. We've made silence the enemy, when actually, silence is home. I learned this the hard way during what I now call my breakdown breakthrough 3 years ago. I was working a job that demanded everything, in a relationship that was draining me, living in a city that never slept. My mind had become this constant background hum of anxiety and planning and second guessing. Then one morning, I just stopped. Not dramatically, not as a grand gesture. I just couldn't think another thought. It was like my mental engine finally overheated and shut down. I was terrified at first. Who was I without my thoughts? What was I supposed to do with myself? But slowly, in that silence, something else emerged. It wasn't emptiness. It was fullness. The kind of fullness you feel watching waves roll onto shore, or sitting by a fire, or holding a sleeping child. Complete, whole, enough. I realized I had been living in my head for so long that I'd forgotten there was a whole universe outside of it, and inside of it. The silence wasn't empty. It was pregnant with everything I'd been too busy thinking to notice.
Let me tell you what silence really is, because it's not what most people think. Silence isn't about having no thoughts. That's not even possible for most of us. And honestly, it's not the point. Silence is about changing your relationship with thought. Instead of being carried away by every mental current, you become like a deep lake. Thoughts can move across the surface, but the depths remain still. True silence is spaciousness. It's that quality of awareness that can hold anything without being disturbed by it. Anxiety can arise, and the silence holds it. Joy can bubble up, and the silence celebrates it. Sadness can flow through, and the silence comforts it. It's not the absence of life, it's life without the constant commentary. Imagine watching a beautiful movie, but someone is sitting next to you the entire time explaining what's happening, predicting what comes next, comparing it to other movies you've seen, wondering if you should be enjoying it more or less. That someone is your overthinking mind, and the movie is your life. Silence is what happens when that commentary finally stops and you can actually experience what's in front of you. But here's something important. Silence isn't something you have to create. It's something you have to stop covering up. It's already there, underneath all the mental activity, like a radio frequency that's always broadcasting but gets drowned out by static. You don't have to manufacture silence, you just have to stop manufacturing noise.
So how do we actually do this? How do we stop the mental motorboat and let the lake become still? The answer might surprise you. We don't do anything. We stop doing. Most meditation practices, most self-help techniques, most productivity systems are about adding something new to your life. But what if the solution isn't addition, but subtraction? What if healing happens not by doing more, but by doing less? The Taoists
have this beautiful concept called Wu Wei, often translated as non-action, but it doesn't mean being passive or lazy. It means acting in harmony with the natural flow of things rather than forcing outcomes through mental effort. Think of learning to float in water. The more you struggle, the more you sink. But when you stop struggling, when you surrender to the water's support, you float effortlessly. Your mind works the same way. The more you struggle with your thoughts, the more they proliferate. But when you stop struggling, when you neither push thoughts away nor follow them, they naturally settle. Let me share a simple practice that changed everything for me. I call it conscious stopping. Throughout your day, maybe 3 or 4 times, just stop. Whatever you're doing, wherever you are, for just 30 seconds. Stop. Don't try to meditate. Don't try to be spiritual. Don't try to fix anything or figure anything out. Just stop. Stop and notice. What do you hear? What do you see? What do you feel in your body? Not as a project or assignment, but just noticing what's already here. You might notice the hum of the refrigerator you'd completely tuned out, the feeling of your feet on the ground, the quality of light coming through the window, your own breath moving in and out without any effort from you. These aren't profound, mystical experiences. They're just life. Life without the mental filter. Life without the constant inner narrator telling you what it all means.
Have you ever noticed that there are tiny gaps between your thoughts? Like the space between words in a sentence, or between notes in a piece of music. Most of us race right through these gaps without even noticing them. But those gaps, that's where life lives. That's where silence is waiting. It's like we spend all our time reading the words on a page and never noticing the white space that makes the words readable. But without the white space, there would be no words at all, just a black mess of ink. Consciousness works the same way. Without the silence between thoughts, there would be no thoughts worth having. Just a mental mess with no clarity, no insight, no peace. The practice isn't to create bigger gaps between thoughts. The practice is to notice the gaps that are already there, to inhabit them, to rest in them. I was walking my dog last week, a simple, ordinary Tuesday evening. My mind was doing its usual thing, jumping from work stress to dinner plans to that awkward conversation from 3 days ago. Then suddenly, for just a moment, there was a gap, a pause in the mental chatter. And in that gap, I actually saw where I was, really saw it. The way the evening light fell through the trees, the sound of my dog's breathing as she sniffed around, the feeling of my own feet touching the earth with each step. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't enlightening in some cosmic sense, but it was real in a way that all my thinking had never been. For just that moment, I wasn't living in my head, I was living in my life. That's what silence offers. Not an escape from reality, but a return to it.
Let's be honest about something. Most of us are addicted to thinking the same way some people are addicted to scrolling social media. It feels productive, but it's actually just compulsive. We reach for our thoughts the way we reach for our phones, automatically, unconsciously, and usually when we're trying to avoid feeling something uncomfortable. Boredom? Think about your to-do list. Loneliness? replay yesterday's conversations. Uncertainty, plan 17 different scenarios for tomorrow. Sadness, analyze why you're sad instead of actually feeling sad. Thinking has become our drug of choice for avoiding direct experience. But like any drug, it stops working after a while. You need more and more mental stimulation to feel engaged with life, until finally, you're completely disconnected from life itself. I remember a conversation with a friend who is going through a difficult divorce. She said something that stayed with me. I've thought about this situation so much that I don't even know how I actually feel about it anymore. I just know what I think I should feel. That's what happens when we live too long in our heads. We lose touch with our actual experience and start living in our ideas about our experience. We become strangers to ourselves. The path back is simpler than we think, but it requires something our culture has forgotten how to value: the courage to be bored, the willingness to sit with discomfort, the radical act of doing nothing when everything in you wants to do something. When was the last time you were truly bored? Not distracted, not entertained, not productive, just bored. If you can't remember, you're not alone. We've systematically eliminated boredom from our lives, and in doing so, we've eliminated something essential: the space where creativity and insight and genuine feeling can emerge. Boredom isn't the enemy of a rich life, it's the gateway to one. Think about the last time you had a creative breakthrough, or a moment of clarity about something important. Where were you? What were you doing? Now, I'll bet you weren't at your computer frantically Googling for answers. You were probably in the shower, or on a walk, or lying in bed half asleep. Those moments of apparent nothing are actually when everything happens. When the conscious mind gets quiet, the deeper intelligence can finally speak. But we're terrified of those spaces now. The moment we feel the slightest hint of boredom or mental downtime, we immediately fill it. Grab the phone, turn on music, make plans, think about problems. We've become like someone who's so afraid of silence that they keep talking to avoid it, but then complain that they never have anything interesting to say. Here's a radical suggestion. What if boredom is not something to be fixed, but something to be explored? What if that restless, uncomfortable feeling that makes you want to reach for stimulation is actually the doorway to a deeper kind of aliveness? I started experimenting with this last year. Instead of immediately filling boring moments, I began to lean into them. Waiting in line at the grocery store without checking my phone. Sitting in my car for a few minutes before going into appointments. Taking walks without podcasts or music. At first, it was almost unbearable. My mind would race around like a caged animal, desperately looking for something to grab onto. But slowly, gradually, something shifted. The frantic quality began to settle. And in that settling, other things began to emerge. I started noticing things I'd been walking past for years. The way shadows move across buildings, the sound of wind in different types of trees, the feeling of my own presence, which had been drowned out by constant mental noise for so long I'd forgotten it existed. More importantly, I started having thoughts worth thinking. Not the repetitive, anxious loops that had become so familiar, but fresh insights, creative connections, genuine intuitions about what mattered to me. It turns out that the mind needs downtime to do its best work. Like a computer that needs to run a defragmentation program, consciousness needs spaces of nothing to reorganize itself into something coherent.
Let me share with you a practice that has become central to my daily life. I call it the silence practice. Though it's so simple, it barely qualifies as a practice at all. Every morning, before I do anything else, before I check my phone, before I make coffee, before I even get out of bed, I spend 5 minutes in silence. Not meditating, not thinking about the day ahead, not reviewing yesterday, just being quiet. Sometimes thoughts arise, and I let them. Sometimes emotions come up, and I welcome them. Sometimes there's physical discomfort, and I breathe with it. But I don't try to do anything with any of it. I just sit in the space where all of these things are happening. What I've discovered is that silence isn't empty. It's incredibly full of aliveness, full of presence, full of the kind of deep knowing that can't be thought but only felt. And this fullness, it stays with me throughout the day. Not constantly, but it becomes like a background frequency I can tune into when the mental noise gets too loud. Here's how you can try this for yourself, starting tomorrow morning. Before you reach for your phone, before your mind starts making its daily list of concerns and plans, just lie still for 5 minutes. You don't need to sit up or find a special position. Just remain exactly where you are and let yourself be quiet. Don't try to stop thinking. That's impossible, and it misses the point. Instead, rest your attention on the silence that holds your thoughts, the space in which thinking happens. If you find yourself getting caught up in mental activity, that's completely normal. Simply notice that you've been thinking and gently return to the silence, like redirecting your attention from the waves back to the ocean that contains them. What you're doing is not trying to achieve some special state. You're simply becoming familiar with the silence that's already here, underneath all the mental activity, the silence that doesn't come and go, but is always present as the background of experience. Some days, this will feel peaceful and restorative. Other days, it might feel boring or uncomfortable. Both are perfect. You're not practicing silence to feel a certain way. You're practicing it to develop a different relationship with whatever you're feeling. Here's something most people don't realize. Silence isn't just mental, it's physical. When your mind becomes quiet, your body naturally follows. And when your body relaxes, your mind naturally settles. They're not separate systems trying to communicate with each other. They're one integrated whole, like a lake where you can't separate the water from its stillness. Next time you're feeling overwhelmed by mental chatter, try this. Instead of trying to quiet your thoughts, quiet your body. Soften your jaw. Release your shoulders. Slow your breath. Let your belly relax. Notice how, as your body settles, your mind begins to follow. This isn't magic or mysticism, it's simple biology. Your nervous system is designed to work this way. Overthinking isn't just a mental habit, it's a physical state of chronic activation. Your body is literally prepared for danger that isn't there, running stress responses that have nowhere to go. The mental noise is often just the surface expression of this deeper physical tension. I learned this during a massage therapy session about 2 years ago. I was going through a particularly stressful period at work, and my mind was in its usual state of overdrive. But as the therapist worked on the tight knots in my shoulders and neck, something unexpected happened. The mental chatter didn't just quiet down, it became irrelevant.
Not because I was avoiding or suppressing it, but because my attention had moved from the stories in my head to the actual felt experience of being in my body. For the first time in weeks, I wasn't thinking about work stress. I wasn't planning tomorrow or reviewing yesterday. I was simply present with the physical sensations of release, of breath, of aliveness moving through me. When the session ended and I sat up, the world looked different. Not because anything had changed externally, but because I was experiencing it from a different place. Not from my anxious mind, but from my grounded body. That's when I understood something crucial. Silence isn't something we achieve through mental effort. It's something we drop into by releasing physical tension. The body knows how to be still. We just have to stop interfering with its natural wisdom.
There's a quality of listening that most of us have forgotten exists. Not listening to respond, or to analyze, or to fix, just listening. Pure receptivity to what's here. We live in such a noisy world, not just external noise, but the constant noise of our own commentary, that we've lost the ability to hear the subtle frequencies of life. But they're always there. The sound of your own heartbeat, the rhythm of breath moving in and out of your body, the deeper currents of feeling and knowing that flow underneath the surface of thought. This kind of listening isn't passive. It's the most active thing you can do because it requires your complete presence. But it's a different kind of activity than thinking or problem solving. It's the activity of pure awareness. I was sitting by a lake last summer, taking a break from writing, when I stumbled into this kind of listening accidentally. I had gone there specifically to think through a problem I was wrestling with, but something about the setting invited a different approach. Instead of diving into analysis mode, I found myself just listening to the place. The sound of water against the shore, birds calling to each other across the distance, the feeling of sun and breeze on my skin. As I listened more deeply, I began to hear subtler things. The quality of silence between the bird calls, the rhythm underneath the seemingly random lapping of waves. My own breathing is part of this larger symphony. And in that deeper listening, something shifted. The problem I had come to think about didn't get solved in the usual way through mental effort and analysis. Instead, it dissolved. Not because I figured it out, but because I dropped below the level where it existed as a problem. From that quieter place, I could see that what I had been treating as a problem was really just a story I was telling myself. The actual situation was much simpler and required much less drama than my thinking mind had made it seem. This is what happens when we learn to listen below the noise. We discover that many of our problems exist only in the realm of thought. And in the silence underneath thought, often solutions appear that we could never have figured out through mental effort alone.
It takes tremendous courage to be present, really present. Not thinking about presence, not trying to be present, but actually showing up fully to what's here, right now. Because presence means being willing to feel whatever you're feeling without immediately trying to change it, fix it, or understand it. It means meeting your life as it actually is, rather than as you think it should be. Most of our mental activity is an attempt to avoid direct experience. We think about our problems instead of feeling them.
We analyze our relationships instead of experiencing them. We plan our future instead of living our present. But life doesn't happen in the realm of thought. It happens here, in the messiness and beauty and unpredictability of immediate experience. I remember a conversation with my sister during her cancer treatment. She said something that cut straight through to the truth. I spent so many years worrying about getting sick that I forgot to notice I was healthy. Now that I'm actually sick, I'm more present with my body than I've ever been. There's something backwards about that. She was right. There is something backwards about waiting for crisis to wake us up to life. But crisis isn't the only teacher. Silence can teach us the same lessons more gently. When you sit in silence, real silence, not the project of trying to be silent, you're forced to be with what's actually here. Not your ideas about what's here, not your preferences about what should be here, just what is. And what you discover is that reality is rarely as scary or overwhelming as your thoughts about reality. In fact, direct experience is often much simpler and more manageable than the stories your mind tells about that experience. The emotion you've been avoiding through mental distraction, when you finally let yourself feel it directly, it moves through you and transforms. The discomfort you've been thinking about obsessively, when you stop thinking about it and just feel it in your body, it often releases naturally. This is the courage that silence asks of us. Not the courage to do something dramatic or heroic, but the quiet courage to be exactly where we are without trying to be somewhere else.
Let me be honest with you about something. When you start practicing silence, your mind is going to fight back hard. It's like trying to train a puppy that's been allowed to run wild for years. At first, it will resist any attempt at discipline, not because it's bad, but because chaos has become its natural state. Your thinking mind has been running the show for so long that it doesn't trust anything else to handle your life. It will try to convince you that silence is dangerous, that you'll miss something important, that problems will pile up if you're not constantly monitoring and managing them through thought. This is normal. This is expected. And this is where most people give up on practices of silence and return to the familiar chaos of mental noise. But here's what I want you to understand. The resistance is not a sign that you're doing something wrong. The resistance is a sign that you're doing something right. You're beginning to shift the balance of power from compulsive thinking to conscious presence. When I first started practicing silence, my mind would literally create emergencies to pull me back into thinking. Suddenly, conversations from 3 weeks ago would seem urgently important to analyze. Random worries about the future would feel like life or death concerns that needed immediate attention. It was exhausting, but I slowly realized that these mental emergencies were almost never about anything real. They were just the mind's way of maintaining its position as the primary focus of attention. Think of it like this. If you've been carrying a heavy backpack for years, your back muscles have adapted to support that weight. When you finally take the backpack off, your back might initially feel unstable because it's not used to operating without that familiar burden. Your mind is the same way. It has adapted to carrying the weight of constant mental activity. When you begin to put down that weight through silence practice, there will be a period of adjustment where the mind feels uncertain and reaches for familiar patterns of thought. This is not a problem to be solved. It's a natural part of the process. The key is to meet the resistance with patience rather than force, with understanding rather than judgment.
You don't need to become a monk or retreat to a cave to access silence. It's available in the smallest moments, through the tiniest doorways, if you know how to look for them. The 3 seconds while your computer is loading, the pause between your exhale and your next inhale, the moment of stillness just before you get out of bed in the morning. These micro moments of silence are everywhere, scattered throughout your day like seeds waiting to sprout. But most of us rush right past them, too focused on the next thing to notice the spaciousness that's always present between things. Here's a practice I call doorway meditation. Every time you pass through a doorway, whether it's entering a building, walking from room to room in your house, or even opening a car door, take one conscious breath in the threshold. That's it, one breath, not as a spiritual practice or a meditation technique, but just as a moment of coming back to yourself. You'd be amazed how these tiny moments of conscious return begin to shift the texture of your entire day. Instead of moving from task to task in a blur of mental activity, you begin to move with small spaces of presence woven throughout. Or try this. The next time you're waiting in line for an appointment, for a web page to load, instead of immediately reaching for stimulation, just wait. Really wait. Let yourself be bored for 30 seconds. Notice what happens. Notice the impulse to fill the space with activity. Notice the slight anxiety that arises when there's nothing to do. And then notice what's underneath that anxiety. The simple aliveness of being here, without agenda, without purpose, without needing anything to be different. These aren't dramatic practices. They won't revolutionize your life overnight, but they will begin to create new grooves in your consciousness, pathways back to the silence that's always here underneath the noise. Think of your inner life like an ecosystem. Right now, for most of us, it's become monoculture, just one species of mental activity crowding out everything else. But healthy ecosystems are diverse. They have space for many different kinds of life to flourish. Periods of activity balanced with periods of rest. Growth balanced with decay. Sound balanced with silence. When we fill every moment with mental stimulation, we create an inner environment where only one thing can survive: more stimulation. Like a forest where all the trees have been cut down except one species, it becomes brittle and unstable. But when we begin to create spaces of silence, other things can begin to grow. Intuition, creativity, the kind of deep knowing that doesn't come from thinking, but from a more subtle form of intelligence. Artists know this, writers know this. Anyone who creates knows that their best work doesn't come from thinking harder, but from creating space for inspiration to arise. But you don't have to be an artist to benefit from this inner diversity. Whatever you do with your life becomes richer when it emerges from silence rather than from mental effort alone. I used to approach every challenge in my life through analysis. Relationship problems? Think through all the possible solutions. Career decisions? Make lists of pros and cons. Even choosing what to have for dinner became an elaborate mental project. But thinking is just one tool in the toolkit of human intelligence. And often it's not even the best tool for the job. Some situations call for feeling your way forward rather than thinking your way through. Some decisions are better made through intuitive knowing than logical analysis. Some problems dissolve when we stop trying to solve them and instead create space for understanding to arise naturally.
This isn't anti-intellectual. It's not about abandoning rational thought. It's about expanding your inner ecosystem to include other forms of intelligence that complement thinking, rather than being dominated by it.
Here's something interesting that happens when you begin to cultivate silence in your own life. You start noticing how noisy most human interaction has become. Not just loud, though our world is certainly that, but energetically noisy, full of mental activity and agenda and the need to fill every space with words or entertainment or stimulation. We've forgotten how to be together in silence, how to share space without constantly generating content to fill that space, how to listen to each other from a place of presence rather than waiting for our turn to speak. But there's a different way to be with people, a way that honors the silence in each person and allows that silence to meet and mingle without being interrupted by constant commentary. I experienced this a few years ago during a difficult conversation with an old friend. We were trying to work through a misunderstanding that had created distance between us, and initially we approached it the way most people do, through explanation and analysis and trying to figure everything out mentally. But somehow, maybe because we were both exhausted by the mental effort, we fell into silence. Not the awkward silence of not knowing what to say, but the pregnant silence of letting truth emerge without forcing it. In that silence, something shifted. We could feel the friendship underneath the misunderstanding. We could sense the love that had gotten temporarily obscured by our stories and interpretations and hurt feelings. When we finally spoke again, we weren't speaking from our defended positions, but from a deeper place of connection. The conversation became less about being right and more about being real, less about solving a problem and more about returning to what mattered. This is what becomes possible when we learn to meet each other from silence rather than from noise. Conversations become richer, conflicts become opportunities for deeper understanding. Even casual interactions carry more presence and authenticity. But it has to start with your own relationship to silence. You can't share what you don't have. You can't invite others into a quality of presence that you haven't developed in yourself.
Let me share some research that might surprise you. Scientists studying meditation have discovered that the benefits don't come from achieving some special altered state. They come from the simple act of allowing the mind to settle into its natural state of rest. Dr. Sarah Lazar at Harvard found that people who meditate regularly actually have thicker prefrontal cortexes, the part of the brain associated with decision-making and emotional regulation. But here's the interesting part. This thickening happens not during intense concentration, but during periods of relaxed awareness. It's like the brain physically adapts to having space. It literally grows stronger when given time to rest rather than constantly performing mental tasks. But you don't need to meditate for hours to access this. You just need to give your mind regular breaks from its habitual activity. Like letting a muscle recover between workouts, consciousness needs periods of rest to function at its best. The traditional approach to mental health often focuses on changing your thoughts, replacing negative thoughts with positive ones, cognitive restructuring, thought monitoring, and sometimes that's helpful. But what if the real healing happens not by changing your thoughts, but by changing your relationship to thinking itself? What if mental health isn't about having the right thoughts, but about not being enslaved by any thoughts, not being carried away by every mental current that arises? This is what silence teaches. Not better thinking, but freedom from the compulsion to think. Not positive thoughts,
but the space in which all thoughts arise and pass away.
There's a moment in developing a relationship with silence when it stops being something you do and becomes something you are. When the practice dissolves and what remains is just naturalness. It's like learning to ride a bicycle. At first, every movement requires conscious effort and attention. But eventually, the bicycle becomes an extension of your body, and riding becomes as natural as walking. Silence works the same way. Initially, it feels like work, something you have to remember to practice, something you have to carve time out for. But gradually, it begins to infuse your regular activities. You find yourself naturally pausing between tasks, breathing consciously without thinking about it, listening to people from a place of genuine presence rather than planning your response. I noticed this shift happening about 6 months into my own silence practice. I was washing dishes, a mundane activity I had always approached as a chore to get through as quickly as possible, when suddenly I realized I was completely absorbed in the task. Not absorbed in thinking about dishes or planning what to do next or listening to a podcast to make the time pass faster, just present with the warm water, the feel of soap and ceramic, the simple movements of cleaning and rinsing. It wasn't mystical or transcendent. It was ordinary in the most extraordinary way. I was fully here, fully engaged with what I was actually doing, rather than somewhere else in my head. That's when I understood that silence isn't separate from activity. It's the quality of awareness you bring to activity. It's possible to be silent while speaking, still while moving, at peace while engaged with the challenges of daily life. This changes everything. Instead of dividing your life into spiritual time and regular time, practice time and real life, everything becomes potential doorways into presence.
Here's something that might seem contradictory. The harder you try to be silent, the more elusive silence becomes. It's like trying to catch your own shadow or fall asleep by forcing yourself to sleep. Silence isn't something you achieve through willpower. It's something you allow by releasing the effort to be anywhere other than where you are. This was the hardest lesson for me to learn. I approached silence the same way I approached everything else in my life, as a goal to be reached through discipline and effort. I would sit rigidly trying to force my mind to be quiet, getting frustrated when thoughts continued to arise. But silence isn't the absence of thoughts, it's the presence of awareness that can hold thoughts without being disturbed by them. You can't force awareness, you can only relax into it. It's like trying to see stars. The harder you stare directly at them, the dimmer they become. But when you relax your gaze and look slightly to the side, they shine more brightly. The same is true for the subtle dimensions of consciousness that silence reveals. The more you grasp for them, the more they withdraw. But when you stop grasping, when you simply rest in not knowing and not doing, they become available naturally. This is why so many wisdom traditions emphasize surrender over achievement, letting go over attaining, being over becoming. Not because these traditions are passive or defeatist, but because they understand something about how consciousness actually works. The deepest transformations happen not through force, but through allowance. Not by making something happen, but by stopping the interference with what wants to happen naturally.
The real test of silence practice isn't what happens when you're sitting quietly by yourself. It's what happens when you're stuck in traffic, dealing with a difficult person, facing a deadline, or navigating any of the 1,000 small challenges that make up ordinary life. Can you access that quality of stillness in the midst of movement? Can you find space even when your schedule feels completely full? Can you rest in silence even when everything around you is chaotic? This is what I call living from silence, not escaping from life into quiet moments, but bringing the quality of silence into engagement with life. It's a different way of being in the world. Instead of reacting automatically to every stimulus, you create a tiny space of choice. Instead of getting swept away by emotional currents, you remain grounded in a deeper stillness while allowing emotions to move through you. Last month, I was in a meeting that was becoming increasingly tense. Different people had different agendas, and the conversation was starting to move in circles, with voices getting louder and positions becoming more entrenched. In the past, I would have either withdrawn mentally or jumped into the fray, trying to solve everything through more thinking and talking. But this time, I did something different. I became very still inside while remaining fully present to what was happening. From that stillness, I could see the situation more clearly. I could sense what people really needed underneath their stated positions. I could feel when to speak and when to remain quiet. When I did contribute, it came from a different place, not from reactive emotion or mental analysis, but from a deeper knowing. The meeting didn't magically transform into perfect harmony, but something in the quality of interaction shifted. People began listening to each other more carefully. The conversation became less about winning and more about finding genuine solutions. This is what becomes possible when you learn to live from silence rather than from noise. You become a presence for peace in situations that might otherwise spiral into chaos, not through doing anything special, but through embodying a different quality of awareness.
One of the most beautiful things about developing a relationship with silence is how it affects the people around you without them even knowing why. When you're present from a place of inner stillness, others feel it. They relax in your presence. They speak more honestly. They access parts of themselves that usually remain hidden beneath social masks and mental defenses. It's like when you're around someone who's genuinely comfortable in their own skin. You find yourself relaxing too, even if you can't pinpoint exactly why. Presence is contagious. Silence is contagious. Peace is contagious. But so is mental noise. When you're internally agitated, stressed, overthinking, people pick up on that energy too. They become more defensive, more reactive, more likely to respond from their own mental chaos. You have a choice about which frequency you broadcast into the world. I started noticing this when my teenage nephew began spending more time at our house. He's usually pretty wound up, constantly on his phone, jumping from topic to topic in conversation, that restless energy that seems to characterize his generation. But something interesting happened during the months when I was deepening my silence practice. Without any direct conversation about it, he began to settle when he was around me. He would put his phone down more often. We would have longer stretches of just being together without the need to fill every moment with talk or activity. One day he said something that surprised me. "I like hanging out here. It's peaceful." He couldn't articulate exactly what was different, but he could feel it. The quality of silence I was cultivating in myself was creating space for him to relax into a different way of being too. This is how change really happens. Not through preaching or teaching or trying to convince others to live differently,
but through embodying the qualities you want to see in the world, through becoming the kind of presence you wish were more common. Developing a genuine relationship with silence isn't a quick fix or a life hack. It's more like tending a garden, something that unfolds gradually over seasons and years, requiring patience and consistent attention. In our instant gratification culture, this can feel frustrating. We want techniques that work immediately, practices that produce measurable results, transformations that happen on our timeline. But the most profound changes in consciousness happen slowly, often below the threshold of conscious awareness, like tree roots growing deeper underground before any new growth becomes visible above ground. I've been practicing silence in various forms for about 4 years now. The first year was mostly about learning to sit still for more than 30 seconds without jumping up to do something productive. The second year was about working with the resistance that arose, all the ways my mind would try to pull me back into mental activity. The third year was when things started to get interesting. I began to notice that problems I had been thinking about obsessively would somehow resolve themselves when I stopped thinking about them. Creative insights would arise in moments of emptiness rather than during focused brainstorming. Difficult relationships would shift when I approached them from silence rather than from an agenda. But it was subtle, so subtle that I almost missed it. The changes weren't dramatic or obvious. They were more like a gradual shift in the background texture of experience. Life didn't become perfect, but it became more workable. Not because external circumstances improved, but because my capacity to be present with whatever circumstances arose became stronger. Now, in year 4, silence feels less like something I practice and more like something I am. Or rather, something I can access naturally throughout the day when I need to return to center, to clarity, to the deeper knowing that lives underneath the surface chaos of daily life. This is what I mean by the long game. You're not just learning a technique, you're developing a different relationship with consciousness itself. You're training in a way of being that becomes increasingly stable and accessible over time. Let me address some misunderstandings about silence that prevent people from exploring it more deeply. First, silence isn't about becoming passive or disengaged from life. Some people worry that if they stop overthinking, they'll become lazy or unmotivated or unable to handle their responsibilities. But actually, the opposite is true. When you act from silence rather than from mental noise, your actions become more effective, not less. You waste less energy on unnecessary worry and second guessing. You make decisions more quickly because you're not paralyzed by endless mental analysis. The most successful people I know aren't the ones who think the most, but the ones who think the clearest. And clarity comes from space, not from mental activity. Second, silence isn't about suppressing thoughts or emotions. It's not about becoming some kind of emotionless robot or spiritual bypassing of human experience. True silence includes everything. It's spacious enough to hold whatever arises: anger, sadness, fear, joy, excitement, boredom. The difference is that you're not identified with these experiences. They can move through you without defining you or carrying you away. In fact, when you stop being afraid of your own thoughts and emotions, when you can let them arise and pass away in the space of silent awareness, you often find that they become less intense and more workable.
They transform from problems to be solved into information to be received. Third, silence isn't a spiritual practice in the religious sense. You don't need to believe in anything particular or adopt any specific worldview. Silence is simply a practical approach to mental health and clarity of perception. Whether you understand it through neuroscience or Buddhism or secular mindfulness or your own direct experience doesn't matter. What matters is whether it helps you live with more presence, less suffering, and greater capacity to respond to life from wisdom rather than reactivity.
Let me address some misunderstandings about silence that prevent people from exploring it more deeply. First, silence isn't about becoming passive or disengaged from life. Some people worry that if they stop overthinking, they'll become lazy or unmotivated or unable to handle their responsibilities. But actually, the opposite is true. When you act from silence rather than from mental noise, your actions become more effective, not less. You waste less energy on unnecessary worry and second guessing. You make decisions more quickly because you're not paralyzed by endless mental analysis. The most successful people I know aren't the ones who think the most, but the ones who think the clearest. And clarity comes from space, not from mental activity. Second, silence isn't about suppressing thoughts or emotions. It's not about becoming some kind of emotionless robot or spiritual bypassing of human experience. True silence includes everything. It's spacious enough to hold whatever arises: anger, sadness, fear, joy, excitement, boredom. The difference is that you're not identified with these experiences. They can move through you without defining you or carrying you away. In fact, when you stop being afraid of your own thoughts and emotions, when you can let them arise and pass away in the space of silent awareness, you often find that they become less intense and more workable. They transform from problems to be solved into information to be received. Third, silence isn't a spiritual practice in the religious sense. You don't need to believe in anything particular or adopt any specific worldview. Silence is simply a practical approach to mental health and clarity of perception. Whether you understand it through neuroscience or Buddhism or secular mindfulness or your own direct experience doesn't matter. What matters is whether it helps you live with more presence, less suffering, and greater capacity to respond to life from wisdom rather than reactivity. Let me address some misunderstandings about silence that prevent people from exploring it more deeply. First, silence isn't about becoming passive or disengaged from life. Some people worry that if they stop overthinking, they'll become lazy or unmotivated or unable to handle their responsibilities. But actually, the opposite is true. When you act from silence rather than from mental noise, your actions become more effective, not less. You waste less energy on unnecessary worry and second guessing. You make decisions more quickly because you're not paralyzed by endless mental analysis. The most successful people I know aren't the ones who think the most, but the ones who think the clearest. And clarity comes from space, not from mental activity. Second, silence isn't about suppressing thoughts or emotions. It's not about becoming some kind of emotionless robot or spiritual bypassing of human experience. True silence includes everything. It's spacious enough to hold whatever arises: anger, sadness, fear, joy, excitement, boredom. The difference is that you're not identified with these experiences. They can move through you without defining you or carrying you away. In fact, when you stop being afraid of your own thoughts and emotions, when you can let them arise and pass away in the space of silent awareness, you often find that they become less intense and more workable. They transform from problems to be solved into information to be received. Third, silence isn't a spiritual practice in the religious sense. You don't need to believe in anything particular or adopt any specific worldview. Silence is simply a practical approach to mental health and clarity of perception. Whether you understand it through neuroscience or Buddhism or secular mindfulness or your own direct experience doesn't matter. What matters is whether it helps you live with more presence, less suffering, and greater capacity to respond to life from wisdom rather than reactivity. Let me address some misunderstandings about silence that prevent people from exploring it more deeply. First, silence isn't about becoming passive or disengaged from life. Some people worry that if they stop overthinking, they'll become lazy or unmotivated or unable to handle their responsibilities. But actually, the opposite is true. When you act from silence rather than from mental noise, your actions become more effective, not less. You waste less energy on unnecessary worry and second guessing. You make decisions more quickly because you're not paralyzed by endless mental analysis. The most successful people I know aren't the ones who think the most, but the ones who think the clearest. And clarity comes from space, not from mental activity. Second, silence isn't about suppressing thoughts or emotions. It's not about becoming some kind of emotionless robot or spiritual bypassing of human experience. True silence includes everything. It's spacious enough to hold whatever arises: anger, sadness, fear, joy, excitement, boredom. The difference is that you're not identified with these experiences. They can move through you without defining you or carrying you away. In fact, when you stop being afraid of your own thoughts and emotions, when you can let them arise and pass away in the space of silent awareness, you often find that they become less intense and more workable. They transform from problems to be solved into information to be received. Third, silence isn't a spiritual practice in the religious sense. You don't need to believe in anything particular or adopt any specific worldview. Silence is simply a practical approach to mental health and clarity of perception. Whether you understand it through neuroscience or Buddhism or secular mindfulness or your own direct experience doesn't matter. What matters is whether it helps you live with more presence, less suffering, and greater capacity to respond to life from wisdom rather than reactivity.
It's easy to access silence when you're sitting by yourself in a quiet room. But what about when your phone is buzzing with urgent messages, your deadline got moved up, your kid is having a meltdown, and your car won't start? This is when silence practice becomes most valuable and most challenging. The tendency is to think that silence is only possible under ideal conditions. But actually, Silence is most needed exactly when it seems least available. When everything is chaotic around you, the ability to find stillness within becomes a survival skill. I learned this during a particularly intense period last year when my father was in the hospital, I was managing a work crisis, and my partner and I were having relationship difficulties all at the same time. Every system I normally use to stay centered felt completely inadequate. My first instinct was to think my way through everything, make lists, analyze options, try to control outcomes through mental effort. But the more I thought, the more overwhelmed I became. I was like someone trying to solve a puzzle while standing in an earthquake. The ground kept shifting underneath me. Then I remembered something a teacher once told me. You can't control the waves, but you can learn to surf. Instead of trying to think my way out of the chaos, I began to practice finding moments of stillness within it, not by escaping from the situation, but by returning to presence while remaining fully engaged with what needed to be handled. Between phone calls with doctors, I would take 3 conscious breaths. While sitting in hospital waiting rooms, instead of scrolling my phone or worrying about everything else on my plate, I would just sit, present with the uncertainty, the discomfort, the not knowing what would happen next. This wasn't about positive thinking or trying to feel better. It was about developing the capacity to be with difficult experience without being overwhelmed by it, to remain grounded in the midst of groundlessness. What I discovered is that silence isn't the absence of activity or challenge. It's the presence of awareness that can hold any amount of activity or challenge without losing its essential stability.
Your relationship with silence will change over time, just like any relationship. There will be periods of deep connection and periods of distance. Times when it feels easy and natural, and times when it feels like work. This is normal. This is expected. Don't use the difficult periods as evidence that you're doing something wrong or that silence practice doesn't work. Sometimes you'll go through phases where your mind is particularly active or resistant. Maybe you're going through major life changes, dealing with stress, or just in a naturally more active cycle. During these times, your silence practice might feel forced or artificial. That's okay. Just keep showing up. Even if you can only find 30 seconds of genuine stillness, that's 30 seconds of returning home to yourself. Even if your mind races the entire time you're sitting quietly, you're still training in the intention to be present. Other times, you'll experience periods of deep peace and clarity that seem to arise effortlessly. Enjoy these phases, but don't become attached to them or use them as the standard against which all other experiences are measured. Silence is like weather. It's constantly changing. Sometimes stormy, sometimes clear, sometimes overcast, sometimes brilliantly sunny. Learning to be present with whatever weather arises in your inner sky is part of the practice. What remains constant isn't any particular state of mind, but the awareness that can observe all states of mind, the space in which all weather occurs.
Eventually, if you stick with silence practice long enough, something shifts. It stops being a technique you apply and becomes a way of being you inhabit. You realize that silence isn't something you do during certain times of day or in certain places. It's a quality of consciousness that's always available, underneath whatever else is happening. This doesn't mean you'll never think or never get caught up in mental activity again.
It means you'll have a reference point for return. When you notice that you've been lost in thought loops or mental noise, you know how to come back to the stillness that's always here. It's like having a compass. You might wander off the path, but you always know which direction leads home. This is when silence practice becomes truly transformative, when it's not separate from your regular life, but infused throughout it. When pausing becomes as natural as breathing. When presence becomes your default mode, rather than something you have to remember to access. But this integration takes time. It takes patience. It takes a willingness to keep returning to simplicity, even when your mind insists that complex problems require complex solutions. Most of all, it takes trust. Trust that there is indeed something underneath all the mental noise, something vast and still and unchanging that doesn't depend on external circumstances for its peace. You can't think your way to this trust. You can only discover it through direct experience, one moment of silence at a time.
So here's what I want to leave you with today. Not a technique or a system or a set of rules to follow, but an invitation. An invitation to experiment with silence, not as another item on your self-improvement to-do list, but as a return to something you've always known, but perhaps forgotten. The invitation is simple. Give yourself permission to stop. Not forever, not even for very long. Just stop. Regularly, throughout your day. Stop and notice what's here when you're not trying to get somewhere else or become someone different or figure anything out. Stop and feel your breath moving in and out of your body without your control or effort. Stop and listen to the sounds around you, not analyzing them or thinking about them, just receiving them. Stop and sense the aliveness in your hands, your feet, your chest, the mysterious presence that animates your body and makes experience possible. These aren't dramatic practices. They won't make you enlightened or spiritually special, but they will do something even more valuable. They'll help you remember what it feels like to be alive, rather than lost in thoughts about being alive. And in those moments of simple presence, you might discover what mystics and poets and ordinary people throughout history have pointed to, that your true nature is not the noisy, anxious, constantly planning mind, but the aware silence in which all experience arises. You might realize that you are not your thoughts, any more than you are the weather that passes through the sky of your awareness. You might find that what you've been seeking through all your mental activity, peace, fulfillment, a sense of being enough, is already here, in the silence you've been avoiding.
Before we close, let me share something personal with you. There was a time in my life when I thought silence was empty, when I believed that if I wasn't constantly thinking, planning, analyzing, and doing, I wasn't really living. I measured my worth by how much I could accomplish, how many problems I could solve, how busy I could stay. Silence felt like a waste of time, or worse, a sign of laziness or depression. But life has a way of teaching us what we need to learn, whether we think we're ready or not. During my father's final illness, I spent many hours sitting by his bedside in the hospital. At first, I brought books to read, work to catch up on, my phone to stay connected to the world outside. But gradually, as I watched him struggle with pain and confusion and the slow process of letting go,
all of that activity began to feel absurd. What did my endless mental projects matter in the face of this profound transition happening right in front of me? So I began to simply sit with him, not trying to fix anything or understand anything or even comfort him with words, just present, sharing the silence. And in that silence, something extraordinary happened. Not magical or mystical, but quietly extraordinary. I felt closer to him than I had in years, closer to myself than I'd been in years, closer to the simple fact of being alive than all my thinking had ever brought me. When he died, it was in that silence we had learned to share, and I realized that silence hadn't been empty at all. It had been full of love, full of presence, full of the kind of intimacy that's only possible when we stop trying to manage experience and start accepting it. That's when I understood that silence isn't the opposite of life. It's life without the constant commentary. It's love without the need to explain love. It's presence without the compulsion to do something with presence.
If what I've shared resonates with you, if you feel ready to explore your own relationship with silence, here's where I suggest you start. Tomorrow morning, before you do anything else, before you check your phone, before you start planning your day, before you even get out of bed, spend 5 minutes in silence. Not trying to achieve anything or experience anything particular, just being quiet with whatever is here. Some days it will feel peaceful. Some days it will feel restless or boring or uncomfortable. All of this is perfect. You're not practicing silence to feel a certain way. You're practicing it to develop a different relationship with whatever you're feeling. During your day, whenever you notice that you're getting caught up in mental noise, overthinking, worrying, planning obsessively, take 3 conscious breaths and pause, just for a moment, just long enough to remember that you are not your thoughts. In the evening, as you're winding down, spend another few minutes in silence, not reviewing the day or planning tomorrow, but simply being present with the transition from day to night, from activity to rest. That's it. Nothing complicated, nothing that requires special equipment or extensive training. Just small, regular returns to the silence that's always here, underneath the noise. And notice what happens, not just in your formal moments of silence, but throughout your day. Notice how relationships change when you listen from presence rather than planning your response. Notice how problems look different when you approach them from stillness rather than anxiety. Notice how ordinary moments become more vivid when you're actually present for them. Most importantly, notice that you are not diminished by thinking less. You are not less intelligent or creative or capable when your mind is quiet. You are actually more available to the intelligence and creativity and capability that arise naturally from clarity.